whispers of Runeterra.
An empire that forged gods from mortals, a civilization that ruled almost an entire continent, and then, in a single heartbeat, it was gone. No slow decline, no centuries of decay. One ritual, one flash of impossible light, and Shurima was erased from the face of Runeterra. So how did a realm that immense, that powerful, vanish in one breath? In this video, you are going to walk through the entire life cycle of Shurima, compressed into under an hour. From the first experiments with the sun disk, when ancient priests tried to drag the power of the heavens down into the mortal world, to the brutal early ascension wars that tested these new god warriors on the battlefield. From the rise of emperors who thought they were chosen by the sun itself, to the single disastrous ceremony where Azir stepped into the light, Zirath broke his chains, and the capital turned to dust. Shurima was not just a desert region on a map. It was one of the great ancient superpowers of Runeterra, standing shoulder to shoulder with Ekathia before the void consumed it, the Blessed Isles before they became the Shadow Isles, and the early mountain cults around Targon that worshipped stellar entities. Essentially, when you look at the dunes and ruins in current times, you are looking at the skeleton of a golden age that once rivaled all of them in magic, infrastructure, and sheer ambition. In order to understand why this matters, you have to see how deeply Shurima is wired into modern League lore. The empty temples you see in cinematics, the buried tombs that champions explore, the broken ascended wandering the world, these are all fallout from that one obliterated empire. Narsus and Renekton were once celebrated sun-born generals. Now one is a haunted guardian, the other a half-mad beast twisted by centuries in a collapsing sun prison with Zerath. The reason the desert is full of shattered obelisks and sun disks is because an entire imperial network was flash fossilized in an instant. We will move chronologically. You will see how a slave boy named Zerath rose to become Azir's closest confidant, how illegal ascension for emperors broke Shurima's own sacred rules, and how that political arrogance set the stage for catastrophe. I'm only speculating here, but the stories, voice lines, and cinematics strongly suggest that this was never just one man's betrayal. It was a system failure. So the guiding question for this episode is simple. Was Shurima destroyed by Zerath's personal vengeance, or by centuries of imperial hubris baked into the ascension system itself? As we follow the timeline from early sun disk experiments to Azir's failed ritual, to the modern journeys of Sivir, Talia, and the resurrected Azir, you will be able to decide which explanation the evidence truly supports. From sun above to sand below, how Shurima's world was forged. To answer that question, you first have to understand what kind of world could even allow Shurima to exist. Runeterra is not a quiet, isolated planet. It sits in a cosmos where celestial beings like Aurelian Sol forge stars the way mortals forge bronze, and where Mount Targon rises as a bridge for cosmic entities to descend and wear mortal bodies as aspects. Essentially, Shurima's greatest invention, the sun disk, is a man-made attempt to plug directly into that same solar divinity. So, how did mortals reach for something so far above them? In order to grasp that, you need the basic structure of the world. Runeterra is split between two intertwined realms: the physical realm of stone, sand, and cities, and the spirit realm of dreams, gods, and raw magic. Every thought, every belief echoes between them. In some places, those realms brush close together, and power leaks through in torrents. Shurima is one of those places. Beneath its dunes run immense ley lines, rivers of arcane power threading through the bedrock of the continent. Ancient priests and seers learn to feel those currents, to predict where storms of magic would break through the surface. The modern desert looks empty, but it is not magically dead. It is magically scarred. The void wars in Acacia, failed rituals and millennia of ascension have burned, twisted and redirected those ley lines, leaving behind glassed craters, haunted oases and ruins half-phased into the spirit realm. Over all of this hangs another threat: world runes. These are primordial sigils used by unknown entities to shape the world itself, the same reality-warping artifacts that will later fuel the rune wars and the ruination. Shurima never openly wields a world rune, but its sun disk technology belongs to the same terrifying category of civilization-level power. You are not throwing fireballs anymore. You are rewriting what a mortal body can be, what a city can survive, what a desert can remember. This is where Ascension comes in. Ascension is a ritual that drags a chosen mortal into the heart of solar power, using the sun disk as a lens to focus celestial energy down into a single, fragile soul. Those who survive are remade as Ascended, also called the Sunborn, towering radiant god warriors such as Nasus, Renekton, and the warrior queen Sitaka. Their bodies become living conduits between realms, their minds stretched across centuries. In Shuriman ideology, this is not just magical augmentation, it is divine mandate. The sun itself is a judge. If you pass, you emerge as proof that the heavens have endorsed your rule. If you fail, you are reduced to ash and forgotten. The sun becomes both religious symbol and literal weapon, burning armies, purifying heresy, and anchoring an entire empire's sense of destiny. I'm only speculating here, but once you convince a civilization that the universe agrees with its conquests, how long before restraint disappears? If Shurima could reach up and drag the power of the sun down into a machine, what kind of people believed they were worthy to stand inside it? And what did they have to build first, politically and socially, to reach that moment? Before the Golden Empire, tribes, beasts, and the first sun disks. So, how did a scattered desert full of frightened tribes become the stage for an empire arrogant enough to command the sun? To answer that, you have to step back to a Shurima that barely exists in current time's memory. Before the Golden Capital, Shurima is a patchwork of oases and hard-bitten settlements. Human clans cling to waterholes, ringed by crude walls and sharpened stakes. Between them stretch killing sands where predators and raiders roam. You have dune beasts that can swallow caravans, marauding bands from the eastern highlands, and inhuman entities slipping in from Acacia and the spirit realm. Travel is a gamble. Most mortals never see beyond the horizon of their own oasis. Around these fragile proto-city states, early hierarchies form. A chieftain might control 3 wells instead of 1. A war leader might force nearby tribes to pay tribute in grain and slaves. Essentially, this is Shurima before Shurima. Dozens of tiny realms, each convinced it is moments away from being erased by drought, monsters, or the next ambitious neighbour. In that kind of world, you look up for answers. Long before any official empire, the sun is already the central god of the desert. Early priesthoods watch its rising and setting, measuring the length of shadows, tracking when the heat grows cruel or merciful. To them, eclipses and sandstorms are omens. In order to survive, they turn astronomy into theology. Shamans paint discs of gold on canyon walls. Seers chant at dawn, begging the sky for protection and power. These first sun cults are fragmented. One oasis claims the sun is a devouring lion, another that it is a patient judge weighing all souls at noon. But the pattern is clear. Any force that can burn away beasts, guide caravans, and promise harvests becomes the obvious candidate for a future state religion. From there, Shuriman curiosity shifts from worshipping the sun to wondering whether its magic can be touched. In stone circles and cliff-top shrines, priests arrange polished metal, crystal, and enchanted sandstone to catch and focus light. Small, regional sun disks appear, not the colossal engine you know, but waist-high rings or etched platforms that flare at noon. Sometimes they heal, sometimes they scorch, sometimes they simply crack and kill everyone nearby. Centuries of trial, error, and sacrifice follow. I'm only speculating here, but you can imagine how many nameless volunteers were promised glory, only to be turned to ash. Each failure teaches the desert something about celestial power and the limits of mortal bodies. Out of this brutal laboratory emerge the first unifiers. Legendary kings and queens who manage to do more than hold a single oasis. They chain routes together. A queen of the southern trade road who guarantees safe passage for caravans. A war king who tames a monstrous sandworm and parades it as a living banner. These rulers start to think in terms of Shuriman people, not just Shuriman tribes. They forge alliances sealed by shared sun rites, standardize calendars around solstices, and commission larger, more ambitious discs in their capitals. Political centralization and religious convergence feed into each other. So, how did these experiments finally leap from dangerous rituals to something closer to godhood? The answer isn't a bigger disc alone, it's a new kind of subject. Somewhere in this era of proto-empires and half-finished temples, priests and rulers stumble onto a terrifying possibility. If you can shape the sun's magic into a beam, perhaps you can shape a mortal to receive it. The first successful ascended is still in the future, but the question has been asked, and Shurima will not stop until someone survives the light. Forging Sunborn Gods, the Ascended and Shurima's divine war machine. That question becomes Shurima's most dangerous experiment, because the answer is yes, you can shape a mortal to receive the sun. Ascension, in concrete terms, is a ritualized execution of that idea. Under the great golden sun disk, priests and astronomer mages focus celestial fire into a single blinding column. A chosen mortal steps into it. If they endure, their flesh is burned away and remade, their soul stretched and tempered until it fuses with that solar power. They emerge as a sunborn, a near-immortal, animal-aspected demigod that no longer ages as mortals do. So, how did this start? Not as a vanity project and not even as conquest. It begins as survival. Shurima has already seen what the void did to Ikathia, already watched an entire region of the world twist into an open wound between realms. In order to stand against that, ordinary soldiers are not enough. The Ascended are designed as living weapons, able to battle void spawn, titans, and rival empires without shattering the desert in the process. Essentially, they are walking siege engines with minds. Early Ascended become archetypes that define the era. Narsus, the jackal-headed strategist, is a warrior scholar whose memory spans centuries of campaigns and libraries. Renekton, the crocodilian champion, is raw fury and loyalty given form, the one you send when you want an enemy stronghold erased from the map. Around them are other Sunborn, some remembered only in fragments, towering hawk forms that command the skies, leonine guardians who stand watch over the capital. To ordinary Shurimans, these are not just generals. They are proof that the sun itself favours their empire. Politically, that changes everything. If your emperor commands beings forged by the heavens, who can argue his right to rule? The Ascended serve as protectors on the frontier and enforcers at home. When a province hesitates to pay tribute, an Ascended simply arrives at the city gates, radiant and silent, and the debate ends. The imperial cult weaves this into doctrine. The sun crowns the empire through its champions, and the emperor is the one who chooses who may stand beneath the disk. But there is a cost. The ritual is not guaranteed to succeed, far from it. Many candidates die instantly, bodies vaporized before the chant is finished. Others survive in a technical sense, but emerge twisted, incoherent, or maddened by voices from beyond the sky. I'm only speculating here, but some failures may never fully return to either realm, becoming the kind of nightmare stories that desert travellers whisper about. The more Shurima relies on this process, the more its entire system tilts onto a single unstable pillar, a poorly understood celestial weapon they can't truly control. Ascended disputes become political crises. Personal grudges between Sunborns start to matter as much as border wars. And somewhere in that growing pantheon of god warriors, one future emperor will decide that merely ruling the Ascended is no longer enough. He will want to become one. And that decision is what puts the fall of Shurima on the calendar. Gods, slaves, and scholars. Power structures. Inside the Shuriman Empire. In order to understand why that decision is so dangerous, you have to see the pyramid he's trying to climb. Shurima isn't just a big desert kingdom. It's a carefully stacked hierarchy, where every layer depends on the one above it, and crushes the ones below. At the very top stands the Emperor, proclaimed as the Sun's chosen. His authority is not just legal, it's cosmic. When he speaks, it is framed as the will of the sun disk itself, the central relic that bridges the celestial realm and mortal Shurima. Beneath him are the ascended, immensely powerful god warriors like Nasus and Renekton, worshipped as living saints, field marshals, and symbols of imperial destiny. They don't just win wars. Their presence turns border skirmishes into holy crusades. Under the Sunborn comes the human elite. High priests of the sun cult, noble houses ruling distant satrapies, and bureaucrats who make sure grain, taxes, and soldiers flow toward the capital. This is where everyday power struggles happen. Who controls which oasis? Who commands which legion? Who has the emperor's ear? Essentially, this is the class that turns divine mandate into paperwork, decrees, and marching orders. But the real fulcrum of the system is the priesthood around the sun disk itself. These technomystics maintain the ascension machinery, interpret omens, and decide who is worthy to become more than mortal. So, how did that play out in practice? If a general wants ascension, he needs their blessing. If an emperor dreams of godhood, he must pass through their hands. They are gatekeepers between mortals and the most dangerous magic in the world, which makes them indispensable and politically terrifying. I'm only speculating here, but any group that can say no to an emperor's immortality request has enormous leverage. Beneath all of that glittering hierarchy stretches the vast underclass. Commoners, conscripts, and uncounted slaves quarry the stone, haul the blocks, and die building the monuments that make Shurima's golden age so impressive. The great ziggurats, the endless avenues, the sun temples you see in modern ruins. Every one of them is a record of chained labour. When Shurima marches to war, Ascended lead from the front, but it's ordinary mortals who fill the ranks and graves. There is also a quieter layer, scholars and early mages clustered around the capital. They study the energies pouring off the sun disk, record celestial cycles, and experiment with arcane patterns. Some are nobles, others are freed or even enslaved savants whose minds are too useful to waste in the mines. Over generations, they begin to notice something dangerous, that this magic behaves with rules, with repeatable structures, not just as random divine favour. In current times, you'd call this the birth of systematic spellcraft. And somewhere in those archives, in the shadow of those laboratories and libraries, a nameless slave boy is listening. He watches priests adjust sigils, hears scholars argue about runic geometry, and learns how power speaks, lies, and justifies itself. So, how did Shurima end up with an emperor's confidant who secretly understands both chains and equations? That's where Zerath's story starts, as a product of this very hierarchy, already thinking that if the system won't let him rise, then the system itself may have to burn. Dating a disaster. Placing Shurima on the Runeterra timeline. Zerath's ambition gives you a personal lens on Shurima's collapse. But to really understand that disaster, you need a clock. Not a Shuriman one, though. You need the calendar that most lore fans quietly use in the background, the Noxian timeline. The Noxian calendar splits history into B, N, and AN, before Noxus and after Noxus. It's not an official in-universe standard carved into some immortal obelisk, but it has become the cleanest way to stack these ancient catastrophes in your head. So, how did Shurima, Icathia, and the Ruination line up around that central reference point of Noxus's founding? In order to place Shurima, zoom far back into the deep BN era. We are talking thousands of years BN, when the world of Runeterra is still dominated by raw magic, ancient empires, and immensely powerful entities walking openly among mortals. Around this time, proto-Freljord tribes are bargaining with old northern gods. The early Blessed Isles are coalescing into a hidden sanctuary of scholars, and in the south, Shurima is raising a sun disk to rewrite what it means to be human. Essentially, Shurima's golden age sits in that mythic band of time when technology and sorcery are the same thing. The Ascension ritual, the forging of god warriors like Narsus and Renekton, and the Empire's great desert-spanning roads all belong to this high, stable plateau of power in the far BN centuries. In current times, when you see Azir's gleaming soldiers in-game, you're looking at a ghost from this very era. But Shurima is not the first disaster on the board. Long before Azir is even born, another Shuriman subject state, Icathia, rebels, and tears open the void. That fall of Icathia happens deep BN, well before Shurima's own day of fall, and it scars the southern continent. I'm only speculating here, but you can imagine Shuriman priests studying that void-torn wasteland and still deciding, arrogantly, that their sun disk magic is safe. Shurima's collapse, triggered by Zerath's sabotage of Azir's ascension, comes later in the BN era. The capital is obliterated, the Empire fractures, and the surviving Ascended drift toward the madness that will birth the Darkin. Yet even this is still ancient history by the time of the Ruination. The Blessed Isles' destruction, Viego's tragedy, and the birth of the Shadow Isles occur much closer to 0 AN, long after Shurima is already buried under sand and legend. Canon keeps the exact numbers deliberately vague, but the relative order is remarkably consistent. So, for this video, we'll treat Shurima as a clean chronological arc, from pre-Ascension desert kingdoms through imperial expansion to Azir's fall and resurrection in current times. From here on, every section moves forward in time. First, Shurima's early expansion, then its mid-imperial peak, its late decadence, the single catastrophic day of fall, and finally, the long aftermath that shapes modern Runeterra. You won't need to track dates, just watch how an empire climbs, stalls, and then vanishes in one blinding moment. The Golden Expansion, how Shurima conquered a continent. Shurima's early conquests are only the prologue. Now you're stepping into the empire at its absolute height, when the desert itself seems to obey imperial will. At the centre of it all stands the capital, a sun-baked labyrinth of stone and gold. Towering ziggurats rise in terraces, each level carved with scenes of ascended victories and ancient cosmic myths. From their peaks, you would see aqueducts arcing across the horizon, carrying water from distant oases into vast cisterns. Those channels split into intricate irrigation webs, turning dead sand into orderly fields and date groves. Essentially, Shurima is performing controlled miracles of engineering every single day. The streets below are just as important as the monuments. Markets spill through wide avenues where caravans from every province converge. You have incense from coastal ports, rare ores dragged from the south, and scrolls copied from conquered libraries. In order to keep this machine running, the Empire builds paved roads and stone way stations, tying the realm together. Above everything, the great sun disk dominates the skyline, an immense ring of radiant metal suspended on its colossal pillars, both religious symbol and very real source of ascension magic. So, how did Shurima project this power across a continent? The answer walks on two legs, the ascended. These god warriors, forged under the disc, lead campaigns not just to destroy enemies, but to reorganize them. City-states are offered a choice: bend the knee, keep your local rulers as vassals, and gain access to Shuriman water, roads, and protection, or face an ascended-led army that almost never loses. I'm only speculating here, but for many mortals that trade must have felt worth it. On the frontiers, that bargain is constantly tested. To the east, monstrous entities spawned from forgotten magics threaten trade routes, forcing Nasus and Renekton to wage brutal cleansing wars. To the north and west, proud city-states rebel, then are broken and rebuilt as client kingdoms. Farther away, early contact with harsh militaristic cultures, ancestors of what will, in current times, become Noxus, and with inventive coastal hubs that foreshadow Piltover and Zarn, shows Shurima where its limits might one day lie. Every border clash pushes the Empire's military and magical capacity to its edge. You still see the skeleton of this world on the modern map of Runeterra. Sivir runs along half-buried imperial highways, their stones perfectly fitted despite millennia of erosion. Talia rides shattered causeways and broken aqueducts, feeling the ghost lines of Shuriman geometry under the sand as she weaves stone. Nasus remembers what those lines once connected: immense libraries, archives, and halls of lore now entombed beneath dunes, their ancient knowledge reduced to a few surviving tablets, and his own grief. From the outside this looks unbreakable. Gods walk among mortals, cities glitter, borders hold. Yet, inside the palace, in the shadow of the sun disk, a lonely imperial prince and a slave boy named Zirath are sharing secrets, dreams, and forbidden studies of arcane power. And that friendship is about to start unravelling everything Shurima thinks it is. Azir and Zerath, from shackles to shadow. Kingmaker. Azir and Zerath are not just two names on a timeline. They are the fracture line running straight through Shurima's golden age. You have to start with Azir as a boy, one prince among dozens in an ancient dynasty, technically close to the throne, practically invisible. He grows up in a palace of marble and sun-gilded stone, surrounded by immensely powerful entities and endless ceremony. Yet he is alone. Tutors drill him on law and history, but he is kept away from real decisions. In order to preserve stability, the imperial court treats him as a spare piece, not a future emperor. So, how did a forgotten prince and a nameless slave end up steering the fate of the realm? For that, you look down, far below the balconies of the sun disk, into the chain gangs and servant halls. Zerath begins there, not even granted a true name. Born to slaves taken in some forgotten border war, he survives by watching. He listens to priests mutter over solar rituals, sees scholars trace sigils that bend sand and light, and he remembers everything. Essentially, before he ever touches magic, he understands that knowledge is its own kind of power. Their paths cross in a single brutal moment. A young Azir, moving through the palace with his retinue, sees a slave boy about to be whipped to death for breaking protocol. The boy is Zerath. On impulse, Azir intervenes. He overrules the overseer, spares the child, and claims him as personal property. Publicly, it is a minor incident. Princes are allowed whims. Privately, it is the first time Azir's word changes a life. From there, the relationship grows in the shadows. Azir sneaks food and scrolls to Zerath. Zerath sneaks gossip, rumours and fragments of forbidden studies back to Azir. What begins as secret kindness becomes a partnership. The overlooked prince suddenly has someone who actually listens to his frustrations. The shackled boy suddenly has access to archives, rituals, and the beating heart of imperial politics. Over the years, Zerath becomes Azir's shadow advisor. He maps the rival factions for him, anticipates which nobles will resist reforms, and quietly arranges for obstacles to disappear. When Azir suggests new trade routes or fairer levies on conquered mortals, the court whispers about his unexpected brilliance. I'm only speculating here, but you can imagine Zerath standing just behind a curtain, feeding one last argument before a crucial speech. Yet only Azir receives credit. Statues, titles, growing authority in the world of Shurima, his victories reshape the Empire's future. Zerath's reward is to remain property. Here is the promise that haunts everything. Azir swears again and again that once he is emperor, he will free Zerath. But each promotion, each council seat, pushes that vow a little further away. Was the true fall of Shurima not the explosion of the sun disk, but the slow erosion of that promise? In current times, when you see Azir and Zerath as enemies on the battlefield, you are really seeing the moment a broken oath shattered an empire, replayed forever in the sands. So, how did that private betrayal turn into a public cataclysm? The answer arrives on the day Azir decides to claim ascension for himself. Gods on the battlefield, Nasus, Renekton, and the wars that shaped an empire. In order to understand why that day becomes an extinction-level event for Shurima, you have to meet the two god warriors who turned its wars into legend. Nasus and Renekton are not just champions you queue into on Summoner's Rift. They are the mind and the fist of an entire empire. Nasus begins as a frail, brilliant scholar. In a realm that worships the sun, he worships knowledge. He is historian, tactician, and archivist of an ancient world still learning what magic can do. When pestilence nearly kills him, the emperor orders the unthinkable. Nasus is offered ascension. Under the blazing sun disk, he is remade into a jackal-headed demigod, immensely powerful, ageless, embodying wisdom and foresight in Shuriman ideology. Statues rise in his image. Children are told Nasus sees beyond all horizons. Renekton is the opposite pole. Where Nasus is calculation, Renekton is momentum. A desert general who leads from the front, he drags shattered cohorts out of sandstorms and breaks rebellions with sheer presence. When Nasus lies dying, Renekton does not hesitate. He demands to take his brother's place in the ascension ritual, to hold off death long enough for Nasus to survive. So how did the Empire repay that choice? By elevating him as well. He emerges as a crocodilian god of war, a living siege engine whose roar can rout armies. Together they redraw maps. Around the height of Shurima's power, Nasus plans campaigns that turn scattered city-states into a coherent empire, while Renekton executes them with terrifying efficiency. They crush uprisings in the southern oases, secure the coasts against pirate kings, and later, when Icathia tears open a void rift, they stand among the ascended hosts that hold the line against inhuman entities clawing into Runeterra. Essentially, the borders of Shurima are written in the footprints of these two brothers. Their victories become foundational myths. Parents tell stories of Renekton hurling Darkspawn back into the void, of Nasus predicting an invasion weeks before the first scout is sighted. In current times, you still feel echoes of that propaganda in their voice lines and in the way other champions speak of Sunborn glory. But there is a cost. Centuries of warfare turn triumph into routine. Immortality stretches days into lifetimes. Narsus, always distant, grows more detached from mortals who age and die while his archives only expand. He becomes a curator of eras, not people. Renekton moves the other way. He clings to the immediacy of battle, to the roar of crowds, to glory as the only thing that proves he still exists. I'm only speculating here, but you can almost chart his sanity against the length of peacetime. Long peace means a restless, unravelling god. This growing disconnect between ascended and mortals quietly destabilizes Shurima. When the sun disk finally overloads, Narsus and Renekton are at the epicenter with Xerath, one trying to contain the impossible, the other ready to sacrifice everything to drag a traitor into the dark. The wars that made them heroes are exactly what make the coming catastrophe so personal. So, how did those godlike brothers end up buried beneath the same disaster they tried to prevent? To answer that, you have to watch the moment Azir steps into the light and the sun disk begins to scream. Cracks in the sun, hubris, decadence, and the illegal dream of an ascended emperor. Azir steps toward the roaring sun disk, but to understand why this moment is so fragile, you have to rewind a few centuries. Shurima did not begin as a realm of silk-draped god-kings. It began as a desperate coalition in a killing desert, where ascension was a brutal necessity, not a luxury. Over generations of victory, that changes. Centuries of unchallenged dominance harden into certainty. The Sunborn, once weapons forged in crisis, become living symbols paraded through marble plazas. Temples that had honoured the sun as an immense, unknowable force now choreograph festivals where every gesture is scripted. Essentially, ritual replaces genuine fear and humility. The Ascended are no longer guardians serving mortals. They are treated as flawless idols, their judgments beyond question. So, how did Shurima try to keep that power from consuming itself? At the heart of imperial law is a single, rigid rule: emperors do not ascend. The sun disk is meant for chosen champions, generals, sages, defenders of the empire, not for the one who already commands armies, taxes, and law. In order to prevent absolute unchecked power, the founders wrote a taboo into the bones of Shuriman religion. A god-emperor would answer to no one, not even the sun. By Azir's reign, that law feels negotiable. I'm only speculating here, but you can imagine how an emperor raised on tales of Sitaka, Narsus, and Renekton might start to question why he alone must remain mortal. Around him, priests chant his titles as if he is already half divine. Nobles flatter him with murals showing him standing among the ascended, and in his ear, always, is Xerath. Xerath, the former slave who clawed his way into Azir's confidence, understands both magic and insecurity. He sees how Azir resents being the weakest presence in any war council. If his generals can be gods, why can't the emperor who commands them? Azir begins to imagine himself as the rightful pinnacle of Shuriman evolution, the mind of an emperor fused with the power of a sun-born entity, a living axis around which all of Runeterra should turn. Not everyone is convinced. Cautious priests read the old laws and whisper that the disk was never meant for imperial flesh. Narsus grows uneasy as he senses the shift from service to worship, from stewardship to entitlement. Some nobles mutter that the empire's founding purpose, survival and stability in a hostile world, is being buried under golden excess. But in the glow of Shurima's confidence, dissent feels unpatriotic, warnings are ignored, softened, or quietly suppressed. Here's the uncomfortable question. Was Shurima doomed the moment it started manufacturing gods at scale? When mortals turned a cosmic artifact into a factory for living weapons, did the fall become inevitable? Or is the true breaking point this single illegal ascension, an emperor stepping into a machine designed for someone else? In current times, scholars argue both sides, but to see how the debate ends, you have to return to the day of ascension itself, when the sun disk finally answers Azir's ambition. The day the sun broke, Azir's ascension ceremony, minute by minute. To understand why Shurima dies in a single heartbeat, you have to slow that heartbeat down. The Day of Ascension is not just a date in a chronicle, it's a sequence of tiny decisions, each one pushing the empire closer to the edge. Dawn over the capital. The desert haze burns away to reveal a city drowned in gold. Banners hang from every archway, sun emblems stitched in shimmering thread, and avenues once used for war hosts are flooded with mortals pressed shoulder to shoulder. Priests move through the crowds in disciplined lines, chanting hymns that have echoed through this realm since the first ascended rose. Above them, the sun disk hums, an ancient ring of impossible metal suspended over the ziggurat, already thrumming with stored magic and solar power. You follow the procession inward. At its centre walks Azir, robes heavy with golden plates, crown bright enough to hurt your eyes. He moves with the certainty of someone who believes history has finally caught up to his own ambition. In his mind, this is correction, not crime. Emperors were never meant to ascend, but in order to secure Shurima forever, he has convinced himself the law was small and the empire is vast. He imagines a new era where no border is threatened, where Shurima's god-emperor stands among the most powerful entities on Runeterra. And he is already rehearsing the moment after. I'm only speculating here, but you can almost hear the speech. Once the ritual ends, he will turn to the crowd, call Zerath forward, and break his chains in front of the world. The slave who became his closest friend, elevated as a free man and honoured advisor. In Azir's mind, this is justice, gratitude, and spectacle all at once. But you need to see the same morning from the shadows. Zerath has walked these corridors for years, not as a guest, but as a bound servant who taught himself forbidden lore. He has studied the sun disker's geometry, the sigils buried under the ziggurat, the way ascension energy flows and recoils. Secret pacts with arcane forces, whispers from beyond the physical realm, and a lifetime of humiliation have hardened into one conclusion. This ritual can be broken, and he can take it for himself. Nasus and Renekton are the Empire's visible guardians that day. Nasus stands on a high terrace, Scholar General overseeing the ceremony, his gaze on omens rather than crowds. Renekton waits closer to the base of the disc, a warrior prepared to intervene against any mortal threat, but not yet imagining the machine itself could turn hostile. So, how did two immensely powerful Ascended miss the real danger? Essentially, because the danger is standing beside their emperor, wrapped in chains, not brandishing a blade. The chanting builds. The sun disk lowers, light condensing into a narrow column over the ascension dais. Azir steps forward, every movement measured, every eye in Shurima fixed on him. Zerath shifts position, aligning himself with the heart of the ritual. Nasus feels the magic spike beyond recorded norms. Renekton senses the air rip, reacts on instinct and hurls himself toward the platform. For a single frozen instant, all of Shurima hangs between futures. Azir enters the beam. The sun disk flares past its limits. Zerath tears off his shackles and hurls his will into the core of the spell. Nasus shouts a warning. Renekton reaches for Zerath, and we cut the moment before the light turns to annihilation. In the next section, we'll walk through what happens when a god-making engine explodes at the centre of an empire. One flash of light. The explosion that turned a continent to sand. The light doesn't just grow brighter, it changes nature. In the instant Azir steps into the beam and Zerath hurls his will upward, the sun disk's precise column of radiance ruptures. What was a controlled conduit of solar power becomes a wild, all-consuming torrent, clawing in every direction at once. Zerath drags the spell into himself, ripping apart the delicate balance between mortal vessel, celestial focus, and ancient machinery. The disk starts to scream. Under the plaza, runic engines that have hummed for millennia suddenly redline. In order to make an ascended, the system is meant to channel just enough stellar magic, then bleed off the excess into the sky. Zerath reverses that flow. He hoards everything. The safeguards melt in a heartbeat. Stone buttresses crack, gold inlays liquefy, and the sun disk overloads, turning from God Forge into bomb. The first physical effects hit the capital faster than thought. At the epicenter, whole buildings don't topple, they vaporize. Palaces, libraries, and crowded balconies simply cease to exist, carved away by raw radiance. A shockwave of heat and force erupts outward, ripping through sandstone and basalt. Monuments shatter into razors of debris. People on the outer tiers see a second sun blossom above the Emperor's platform, try to scream, and are reduced to drifting ash between one heartbeat and the next. Farther out, survival is worse. The ground heaves as support tunnels collapse, streets buckle, and colossal statues pitch forward, burying thousands under avalanches of carved stone. The city's golden age ends not in a slow decline, but in a storm of fire, pulverized rock, and boiling sand tearing through every open space. At the center of this, reality itself starts to warp. The sun disk is no longer just emitting light. It is tearing at the boundary between realms. Space around it bends. Edges of buildings stretch and smear, and the air becomes a visible lattice of burning sigils. Immensely powerful currents of solar magic blast outward and upward, punching a column through the sky. The plaza floor sloughs away, leaving a crater that fuses into glass. Shockwaves of disrupted magic race across Shurima, destabilizing wards, mutating latent ley lines, and seeding long-term corruption in the land. Narsus and Renekton are not spectators here. They hurl themselves into the maelstrom, trying to reach Zerath before the disk fully detonates. Narsus attempts to sever the spell, to divert its flow back into the heavens, but Zerath is already more energy than man. So, how did they stop Shurima from being completely erased from Runeterra? Renekton chooses the only option left. He tackles Zerath and forces both of them, and Nasus with them, into the heart of the sun disk's collapsing core. Essentially, the three most powerful entities on the platform become a living containment seal. I'm only speculating here, but their clash of wills and aspects cages part of the explosion, twisting it inward into a pocket of broken time. All three are trapped in a collapsing, timeless prison as the disk implodes around them. Outside, the one flash of light becomes a continental sentence. Shockwaves roll out through bedrock, cracking aquifers, diverting rivers, and throwing dust high into the atmosphere. Over months and years, climate patterns shift. Rain retreats. Fields die. Forests wither. The fertile heartland of an empire decays into the endless dunes you see in current times. Every dune sea, every glassed ruin is a permanent monument to one act of betrayal. So how did this single instant echo into future ages of war darken and ruin across the world? That's where we go next. Buried alive, survivors, lost bloodlines, and the long silence after the fall. Buried alive, survivors, lost bloodlines, and the long silence after the fall. When an empire dies in a heartbeat, the story doesn't end. It just goes quiet. You go from a roaring capital to scattered pockets of mortals, blinking through dust storms, trying to understand why the sun itself seemed to turn on them. In the immediate aftermath, survival is the only law. Around the crater where Shurima's heart once stood, caravans are shredded, aqueducts crack open, and wheat fields flash boil into glass. Ordinary citizens stagger out from half-buried homes, only to find the roads gone and the horizon replaced by a rising sea of sand. Former slaves feel their shackles fall away as the magic brands of the empire fail, yet freedom arrives in a realm with no food, no water, and no masters left to organize anything. So, how did you rebuild a life in a landscape that was still collapsing under your feet? For many, the answer is simple: you didn't. Farther from the epicenter, city-states that once answered to the sun disk suddenly stop receiving orders. Governors become kings. Provincial garrisons become independent warbands. Priesthoods cut off from the central temples cling to fragments of doctrine and devolve into local cults, each insisting they alone remember the true rites of the ascended. In order to make sense of the catastrophe, oral histories start to bend. The Golden Age becomes brighter in memory, the day of wrath more supernatural, until the fall is blamed on vengeful entities, offended gods, or mythical beasts. Essentially, history begins to calcify into legend. Yet, not everything is lost. Certain bloodlines, sheltered in distant oases and minor noble houses, quietly endure. One of these will, over centuries of dilution and obscurity, produce a desert mercenary named Severe, carrying a curved ancient weapon, the Chalikar, once wielded by Azir himself. Across the dunes, sealed tombs and forgotten vaults survive beneath collapsed ziggurats, preserving star charts, ascension formulas, and relics of immense power in airless dark. I'm only speculating here, but you can imagine small desert tribes trading stories of cursed ruins where metal sings when touched and sand flows uphill around buried doors. At the exact centre of the wound, 3 god warriors do not die, they fall out of time. Zerath, Nasus, and Renekton are trapped within the ruined sun disk, their bodies and minds pinned in a storm of broken celestial magic. Outside, their names fade into half-remembered tales of a jackal sage, a crocodile warlord, and a traitor made of living fire. Inside, they wage a private, centuries-long war, Zerath straining against his bonds, Renekton's sanity eroding in the dark, Nasus clinging to duty as the realm forgets him. Centuries roll on. Sand buries avenues, then palaces, then whole cities. In current times, most of Runeterra only knows Shurima as a rumour, an ancient sun empire swallowed by the desert. But bones do not forget. Somewhere under those dunes, a single drop of royal blood and a single misstep toward the wrong ruin will one day wake a dead emperor, and the empire's skeleton will start to move again. Speculation break. Was Shurima doomed by Zerath or by its own gods? But before those bones start to move, we need to pause. What you've heard so far is solid lore. What comes next is informed conjecture. This is a speculation break. Everything here is stitched together from stories, voice lines, and dev commentary. Essentially, we're stepping out of the timeline to ask a dangerous question. Was Shurima doomed by one man, or by its own gods? So, how did the Zerath did everything theory take shape? In this view, the empire was stable, the sun disk was proven, and the only reason it all disintegrated in a heartbeat was one immensely powerful slave mage. Azir's ascension was illegal by Shuriman law, yes, but the ritual itself had worked for centuries on generals and heroes. If Zerath hadn't overloaded the magic, the argument goes, the disk might have endured one more time. You'd get a god emperor, radiant and terrible, but the capital wouldn't have been vaporized, and the desert wouldn't have swallowed half the realm. I'm only speculating here, but imagine that outcome. An immortal Azir, backed by Nasus and Renekton, commanding an army of Ascended. No Icathian rebellion to open the void this time. no sudden power vacuum. Shurima could have marched across Runeterra as an eternal sun empire, crushing any mortal resistance long before it grew. In current times, instead of scattered ruins for Sivir and Talia to explore, you might have golden highways and sunborn legions enforcing the Emperor's will. The second theory flips that on its head. In order to understand it, you have to look at the system, not the saboteur. Shurima built its greatness on slave labour, divine mandate, and a machine that turned mortals into living weapons. That kind of hubris invites catastrophe. Whether through Zerath's betrayal, another Ascended's revolt, a ritual misfire, or some cosmic backlash from the entities behind the sun disk, something was going to snap. When a realm treats people as fuel and godhood as a tool of state, can it really last? Here's the pattern interrupt. What if the real pivot wasn't the Ascension Day at all, but the years before it? Some fans argue that if Azir had freed Zerath much earlier, truly broken the chains, not just promised it on the platform, everything changes. A reformed empire, a trusted advisor instead of a resentful slave, and no reason to sabotage the ritual. Could Shurima have slowly dismantled its worst cruelties from within, becoming a gentler sun that still guides the world? Or does Zerath himself make that impossible? His voice lines drip with hunger for power, for the raw magic of the disc. Even as a free man, would he have accepted being anything less than ascended? This theory says no, his arc was always spiralling toward the heart of the sun. Remove one opportunity, and another arises. A different ritual, a different coup, the same explosion in a new shape. Ultimately, whichever theory you favour, the factual timeline in Runeterra is fixed. Zerath does betray Azir, the sun disk does erupt, Shurima does fall. The Empire becomes a graveyard and its Ascended become Darkin or exiles. And that's where we return to the main story, because in current times those ghosts are waking up, and the modern world is not ready for an Empire's second sunrise. Echoes in the sand, Sivir, Talia, and the first signs of a waking empire. And those ghosts don't just linger in stories, they walk the desert. In current times, Shurima's second life doesn't begin with emperors or ascended. It starts with a mercenary. Sivir is born in the shadow of broken obelisks, a descendant of Shuriman royalty who has no idea an empire's blood runs in her veins. To her, the desert is not a sacred realm. It's a contract. A place where you guide caravans, raid tombs, and sell whatever ancient treasure you can pry out of the sand. So, how did a sellsword treasure hunter become the key to a dead empire's heart? Essentially, Sivir's entire life is built on walking over history. She leads expeditions into forgotten vaults, stepping across murals of emperors she's related to, prying open sarcophagi sealed by her own ancestors. I'm only speculating here, but there's a cruel irony in how often she dismisses the old stories as superstition while literally carrying an heirloom blade, the Chalikar, forged for Shuriman royalty. Parallel to her, another thread is weaving through the dunes. Talia is a young stone weaver from a nomadic Shuriman tribe, a mortal whose magic resonates with the land itself. Where others see dunes and rock, she feels fault lines of buried power. In order to understand her role, think of Talia as a living seismograph for the Empire's corpse. The more she travels, the more the broken bedrock of Shurima shudders under her presence, reacting to ancient spells and ascended ruins slumbering beneath the surface. Their paths converge not in a palace, but in a tomb. Around the same deserts where the capital once stood, Sivir takes a job that feels routine. Escort a client into a newly uncovered site, crack it open, get paid. The client is Cassiopeia of Noxus, hunting for weapons and secrets to tilt the balance of power in the wider world of Runeterra. The tomb they enter is no ordinary crypt. It is a sealed chamber tied directly to Azir's final day, guarded by wards that still hum with sun disk magic. Inside, everything goes wrong. Traps spring, stone guardians stir, and Sivir is mortally wounded. Her blood spills across the floor, running through dust-choked grooves until it touches ancient golden sigils keyed to the Emperor's bloodline. This is the lock Shurima has been waiting centuries to open. The reaction is immediate. The sigils blaze, the air thickens, and a surge of solar magic races through forgotten channels beneath the desert. Far away, Talia feels the land convulse, waves of stone and sand rippling as if the realm itself is taking a breath. Deep below the ruins of his own capital, Azir's shattered form begins to reconstitute. Sand becomes flesh, gold reforms into armour, and a long-dead emperor opens his eyes to a world of dunes and broken pillars, utterly convinced only moments have passed. He does not yet know that in the instant he reached for godhood, his empire died, and that what he's awakening to may no longer be his to rule. The Emperor returns, Azir's resurrection, and Shurima's second rising. Azir's first breath is sand. Grains cascade from his lungs as he staggers upright beneath the dead husk of the sun disk. To him, the ascension chant is still echoing, the crowd is still roaring. Then his eyes adjust, and there is only silence. It was a world-spanning capital once. Now, in every direction, you have dunes, half-buried obelisks, and broken colonnades stretching to the horizon. So, how did an emperor process waking into his own apocalypse? At first, he can't. His memories of the ascension are fractured. The blinding corona of solar magic, Zirath kneeling, Narsus and Renekton standing guard, then white heat and nothing. Azir clings to the only narrative that makes sense to him, that a momentary disruption has occurred, and the Empire waits just beyond the next dune. Each step through the ruins tears that illusion apart. As he wanders the shattered avenues, recognition becomes horror. Here was the grand processional road. Now it is a jagged trench. Here stood statues of the ascended host. Now they lie decapitated in the sand. Essentially, the greatest city of Runeterra has been turned into a tomb. In order to understand what happened, Azir reaches back through centuries of denial and pride. The images come in flashes. Forbidden discussions with Zirath about taking the sun disk as power for himself, ignoring ancient law that emperors must remain mortal, promising freedom to his friend and never granting it. I'm only speculating here, but this is probably the moment where admiration curdles into realization. He sees Zerath at the heart of the memory, not as a servant, but as a sorcerer unshackling himself in a storm of raw celestial fire. Azir understands that the ritual was sabotaged, that his own illegal ascension gave Zerath the opening, and that his broken promises forged the resentment that destroyed Shurima. The betrayal is personal, but the culpability is shared. Then the desert moves. Calling on the same solar power that once nearly unmade the realm, Azir raises his arms, and the buried bones of his empire answer. Entire avenues heave upward as if the world itself is exhaling. Sunken pylons sheer free from the dunes. Statues of gold and sandstone reassemble, joints grinding, eyes igniting with pale light. Whole ziggurats wrench themselves from the earth, shedding centuries of sand in cascading waterfalls. This is not a full restoration, it is a partial resurrection, a ghost of Shurima forcing itself back into the present. In current times, that spectacle doesn't just impress wandering mortals, it terrifies them. Talia, nomad tribes, city-states that grew up in Shurima's shadow, they witness an immensely powerful, ancient entity stepping out of legend and claiming to be their emperor. Some fall to their knees in awe. Others clutch weapons, remembering that their ancestors were once conquered, taxed, and marched as expendable soldiers. Azir sees himself as a returning saviour. Many see only the golden face of old oppression. This tension becomes the new central question of the desert. Is Azir's second Shurima a chance at redemption, a reforged empire built on justice rather than slavery? Or is every rising obelisk the first stone in rebuilding the same cycle of divine rule, conquest, and eventual catastrophe? The empire is stirring again, but Runeterra has changed, and the world may not accept a god-emperor so easily this time. Broken gods, unleashed, Zerath's freedom, Renekton's madness, Narsus's exile, but Azir isn't the only thing that wakes when the sun disk stirs. The empire doesn't just rise in stone and sand, its broken gods rise with it. So, how did those ancient ascended, supposedly entombed with Shurima, return to the realm of mortals? The answer sits right above Azir's head. When he partially restores the sun disk, when Talia's earth-shaping and shifting ley lines strain the foundations of the capital, the immense, unstable magic sealed in that structure begins to move again. Deep within, in a pocket of warped reality created at the moment of Shurima's annihilation, Zerath, Narsus, and Renekton have been locked in a timeless, howling battlefield. Essentially, Azir's rebirth is also a jailbreak. The disk fractures in new ways, its ancient wards cracking. The prison that once held three immensely powerful entities as a single knot of burning light finally splits. Zerath is hurled free, Narsus is flung out into the wider desert, and Renekton claws his way into the world as the last chains of that inner nightmare snap. Zerath's return is not the return of a man. His body was vaporized at the moment he stole Azir's ascension. In order to survive, he fused himself with the unleashed solar magic. In current times, what you see is a being of pure, volatile, arcane energy, barely contained in floating shards of ceremonial armour. He is translucent, crackling, an open wound of power in the air. Centuries of isolation have refined his hatred for Shurima, for emperors, and especially for Azir into a single radiant obsession. Tear down every trace of the empire that once chained him. Renekton does not emerge so cleanly focused. Trapped in that collapsing sun disk, he was the one who chose to stay behind and hold Zerath in place while Narsus escaped. I'm only speculating here, but imagine endless ages where the only voice you hear is your prisoner's. Zerath whispers, accuses, rewrites memories. Over time, Renekton's heroic sacrifice curdles into paranoia. When the prison finally breaks, he bursts out as a storm of teeth, sand and bronze, convinced that Narsus abandoned him on purpose. His rage turns inward as much as outward. Every battlefield is also a reenactment of that last moment in the light. Narsus, by contrast, carries his scars on the inside. He escapes with his intellect and sanity mostly intact, but burdened by the knowledge that he failed twice. He could not prevent Zerath's treachery, and he could not save his brother. In current times he wanders the desert margins, a jackal-headed archivist and guardian, intervening in Shuriman affairs only when absolutely necessary. He studies ruins, deciphers omens, and watches Azir's new empire with wary, exhausted eyes. And this is the real twist. The very ascended who once built Shurima's golden age now threaten whatever rises from its bones. Old grudges, slave against emperor, brother against brother, spill forward into the modern world. The question is no longer just whether Shurima will return, but whether Runeterra can survive the return of its broken gods. Ancient sins, modern wars, how Shurima's fall shapes today's conflicts. And the consequences don't stay politely inside the desert. In current times, the ruins of Shurima are a strategic crossroads, not a forgotten graveyard. The same magical blast that turned fertile heartlands into sand also left scars in the fabric of the realm. So, how did those scars become modern fault lines? Essentially, the dead empire sits between Noxus's southward ambitions, Piltover and Zaan's trade arteries, and strange void-touched anomalies that no one fully understands. Noxian generals look at Shurima and see soft underbelly. March through the desert and you can threaten Ionia from the west, or Piltover from the south. Piltover's merchants see something else. Buried sun disks, old ascended relics, and ancient infrastructure that could supercharge Hextech. Zaan's chem barons don't care if the magic is corrupted, as long as it's immensely powerful. I'm only speculating here, but you can imagine how many secret expeditions vanish under those dunes. Then there are places where reality itself glitches. Icathia's old rebellion against Shurima tore a hole to the void, and that wound never really healed. In order to understand modern geopolitics, you have to see Shurima as a buffer zone between the civilized world and the unknowable. When Kog'Maw or Rek'Sai surface, they're symptoms of a much older infection that started when Shuriman pride tried to chain the stars, and the void answered. Over all of this hangs Zerath. He's not just a local tyrant blasting pyramids. His mastery of raw, unbound arcane power turns him into a roaming magical disaster. If he perfects what he stole from the sun disk, he could destabilize entire regions, overloading ley lines beneath Piltover, igniting Targonian star magic, or even triggering another Rune War-scale catastrophe. The world of Runeterra has seen what a single reckless mage with world-shaping artifacts can do. Zerath is that threat, but immortal and furious. Opposite him stands Azir, whose return sends ripples through every major power. Noxus hears rumours of a resurrected god-emperor and has to ask, can even their legions break an army of sand and living statues? Mount Targon, the realm of aspects who once helped build the sun disk, cannot ignore a mortal who tried to crown himself a sun. Do they see Azir as rival asset or future cautionary tale? Other nations, from Demacia to Bilgewater, quietly panic at the idea that an ancient imperial ideology might literally rise from the ground. Inside this grand strategy game are deeply personal wars. Narsus roams the desert, torn between scholar and executioner, hunting Zerath while still hoping to save or end Renekton. Sivir, descendant of Azir's bloodline, wrestles with the crown she never asked for. Every step she takes towards Shurima's legacy threatens to pull her into god-kings and destinies she doesn't trust. Talia feels the land itself shift under Azir's command, and fears that every glorious monument he raises will bury villages and innocents in the process. So, how did one empire's collapse stay relevant for thousands of years? Because Shurima's fall wasn't an ending, it was the opening of a fault line that runs under the current age. Every Noxian campaign in the south, every Piltover dig site, every tremor of void energy in the dunes echoes choices made on the day Azir stepped into the light. And as more powers converge on those sands, the question becomes, will the next age of Runeterra be built on Shurima's ruins, or shattered by them? From Golden Age to Warning Label, what we've learned from Shurima's collapse. So, how did all of that sand and ruin we see in-game become such a dense warning label for the entire world of Runeterra? To answer that, you can rewind the whole Shuriman story in your head now, from its tribal dawn to its trembling rebirth. It begins with scattered desert tribes, fragile mortals trying to survive an unforgiving realm. Around them, ancient magic pooled beneath the dunes. When Targonian entities helped raise the sun disk, everything changed. That machine temple in the sky turned chosen warriors into ascended, immensely powerful god soldiers. Nasus, Renekton and others became living weapons, and in order to secure Shurima's borders, they marched outward until the empire stretched from coast to coast. Imperial expansion brought roads, aqueducts and golden cities, but also a brutal slave economy and a belief that the emperor's will was literally sanctioned by the sun. Essentially, Shurima decided it could manufacture gods on demand and bend the realm to their command. Into this system were born two boys, Azir, the overlooked imperial heir, and Zerath, the nameless slave who became his closest friend. Their partnership was real, but it was built on a promise Azir kept delaying: true freedom and equality for Zerath's people. Over centuries, Azir dreamed of a perfected empire, while Zerath secretly mastered forbidden magic and nursed a growing resentment. The law said emperors must never ascend. The sun disk was meant as a check on personal ambition. Azir chose to break that law. On the day of his illegal ascension, the capital gathered in celebration, the sun disk blazing overhead, the empire at its absolute height. Then, in a single heartbeat, it all inverted. Zerath shattered his chains at the ritual's peak, hijacking the magic, overloading the disk, and tearing the city apart. Narsus and Renekton hurled themselves into the core to stop him, vanishing into the light. When the dust settled, Shurima wasn't just conquered or corrupted, it was gone. The heartland became desert, the sunborn scattered or driven mad, and for millennia the empire existed only as buried ruins and half-remembered myths. In current times, that silence finally breaks. Azir rises from the sand, half-ascended and haunted, trying to rebuild without repeating his old arrogance. Zerath roams as raw arcane fury, the weaponized resentment of the oppressed. Narsus carries the weight of endless duty. Renekton embodies what happens when that duty curdles into madness. And in the foreground, Sivir and Talia walk the ruins as the new generation, literally bleeding on the stones of a fallen empire they never chose. I'm only speculating here, but this is the point where Shurima stops being background lore and becomes a lens. You now have the full spine of its history, enough to decode every Shuriman, cinematic, champion voice line and short story you encounter. So, is Shurima now just a cautionary tale about power and pride? Or are we watching a second act unfold where redemption, or an even worse collapse, is still very much on the table? Choose your emperor, Azir, Zerath, or no one. CTA and Next Law Deep Dive. So now that you've walked through the entire rise and fall of this desert empire, there's one question you can't dodge anymore. Whose Shurima do you believe? Azir tells you a story of tragic hubris. In his version, an ambitious but well-meaning emperor overreached, paid the price, and is now clawing his way toward redemption under the same burning sun that destroyed him. Zerath, on the other hand, is the slave who watched an ancient machine of conquest from the bottom rung and decided the only moral answer was to break it, even if that meant turning the capital into glass. Then there is Narsus, the scholar general who saw both the glory and the horror from within, and who now walks the realm with a mournful, almost judicial distance. So, how did these three narratives survive when the empire itself was erased in a heartbeat? Essentially, each one preserved a different morale of the story. Azir says, the system was flawed, but the dream was noble. Zerath says, the dream itself was built on chains and needed to burn. Narsus says, power without restraint always trends toward catastrophe, no matter who holds the sun disk. In order to really lock this in, I want you to choose your emperor. In the comments, tell me which Shuriman champion's perspective you side with and why. Are you with Azir, betting that a resurrected Shurima can finally be just, even though it still relies on the same ancient magic and symbols of empire? Do you lean towards Zerath, arguing that any attempt to rebuild on those foundations repeats the original sin? Or do you find yourself with Nasus, believing that both are trapped in an old pattern the world of Runeterra has seen too many times? And that leads to the second question. Do you think Azir's new Shurima can ever be truly different from the old one? When you watch Talia recoil from his vision of a restoration, or Sivir caught between bloodline and survival, what does that tell you about where this story is really heading? I'm only speculating here, but future conflicts in the desert may say more about Runeterra's next age than about its past. From here, we can zoom out again. If you want another every major event explained timeline, you have 3 clear paths. We can follow the ruination of Camavor and the Blessed Isles, watching Viego's obsession and a single destabilized world rune turn paradise into the Shadow Isles. We can track the rise of Noxus as a successor empire, inheriting the same questions of conquest and freedom that once defined Shurima. Or we can go further back to the fall of Icathia and the opening of the Void, when desperate mortals invited something far worse than any emperor into the world. This channel's whole format is built so you can essentially download entire regions' history in one sitting. Dense, fast, chronological, from cosmic entities to current times. If that's useful, subscribe or just keep going through the playlist to stitch together your own mental map of the world. Because somewhere under the Shuriman sun, another decision is already forming. Another gamble with power that will decide whether this empire's fall was an ending, or only the first act of a much larger story.